Good morning. It's great to see all of you this morning. We're going to continue our study of looking at the historical Jesus. We're going to kind of finish this piece today, or either today or next week, and then we're going to really kind of focus on the development of how the church responds and understands Jesus. And this is a little heady stuff, and there are folks who really kind of like a lecture, and there are folks who like more discussion and more. But one of the reasons I'm doing this is that in the Episcopal Church, we spend a lot of time talking about faith, and we don't talk a lot about the person who started the faith. And we're trying to take a little bit of a deeper approach with this to explore all the questions and possibilities and thoughts we have about Jesus, and to try to do a balanced approach. And that's why today I want to look at not just Marcus Borg, who is on the more progressive end, but N.T. Wright, who is, I'm not going to call him conservative. He represents some conservative sides, but he's not really an evangelical conservative in the sense of some of them. He has a balanced approach. He and Marcus Borg are friends. They've written a book together, as David mentioned last week, and I'm going to play a bit in a second just to get us going, and then maybe we can do a little bit more discussion this morning it really was a debate between the two of them on the historical Jesus or the pre-resurrection Jesus. It started with a statement by each, and that's what I'm going to play today, is the statement by each. Have you heard this, David, this recording?
Not sure which one
Is the one they did in Canada. And each one, and then they debate back and forth.
There's one on PBS.
This is not the same one, no. But it's an interesting debate because they are friends, but they do disagree in some points. But I'm not going to play this first part. But Marcus Borg, and you can read their brief bios in the front of this sheet, and then I've created a synopsis about what they're going to talk about in their statements about Jesus. But in essence, I thought Marcus Borg prefaced this conversation by saying that he comes more out of the secular teaching world. He's taught in secular universities, and it's given him a particular perspective on Jesus because he's taught about Jesus not only to Christians, but to Jews, to Muslims, and to others. And therefore he can't use some of the Christian presuppositions that N.T. Wright, who has been Bishop of Durham, who's worked at Westminster Abbey and others, that he takes, because he is able to engage more in some of the Christian presuppositions. Folks, as you come in, there's a sheet on the table right there in the center if you'd like to pick one up. So I'm going to play this, an excerpt here to get us going, and then we'll take a moment to talk, and you can follow some of the general ideas on the sheet here. The first person is Marcus Borg, and he's an American New Testament scholar, a very prolific writer, as is N.T. Wright.
First talk, especially, if you've read Meeting Jesus Again for the first time or Jesus in a New Vision, there won't be much new here for you.
How is the sound? Can everyone hear it? Anyone can't hear it?
My sketch begins with a negative statement, then a very brief prologue statement, then a 5-stroke sketch, and I will do that in 11 minutes and 57 seconds. The negative statement. The negative statement is basically a negation of the image of Jesus that I grew up with. The image of Jesus I received as a child what I now call the popular image of Jesus, the sort of lowest common denominator image of Jesus, very common in Christian circles, I think, had clear answers to the three classic questions of his identity, his purpose, and his message. His identity, who was he? He was the divinely begotten Son of God. His purpose, or his intention, was to die for the sins of the world. And his message was basically about himself, about who he was, and about his purpose, and about the importance of believing in him. Now, as I say, that's the image of Jesus I acquired as a child. All three of the major elements in that image, identity, purpose, and message, I now no longer see to be accurate descriptions of the pre-Easter Jesus or the historical Jesus. I don't think that Jesus thought of himself as the Son of God in some unique sense of the word. I'm skeptical that he thought of himself as the Messiah. I'm convinced that in any case, he did not talk about being the Messiah or about being the Son of God. I don't see his own purpose as dying for the sins of the world. Indeed, I'm very skeptical that he saw his own death as having any kind of salvific significance at all. And I'll say more about that this afternoon when I talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it therefore follows, of course, that his own message was not about himself, about his identity or his purpose being dying for the sins of the world. And for him, the crucial thing was not to believe in him. I think as a historical figure, Jesus was profoundly theocentric, pointing to God and not to his own person. That's the negative. The brief prologue statement. I want to underline that I see Jesus as a deeply Jewish figure. And by that I don't mean simply that he was born Jewish and grew up Jewish, but he remained Jewish all of his life. And I think he saw himself as doing something within Judaism. I don't think his own intention was to establish a new religion. I don't think that his battle was against Judaism. I think he was a Jewish figure who saw himself doing something within Judaism. I emphasize that because it's important in its own right, but also because my use of cross-cultural categories in a moment might suggest that I'm removing him from the Jewish tradition, but that's not my intention at all with these cross-cultural categories. Now, to move to my sketch of the pre-Easter Jesus, a sketch with 5 strokes. By the way, I like the language of sketch better than the language of portrait. I don't think we have enough detail that we can be confident about to do a portrait or a picture, but I think we can do a sketch with broad strokes in it. So each of these statements then is 1 stroke in this 5-stroke sketch. First stroke. He was a religious ecstatic. Now, religious ecstatics are known in every culture that we know of, and of course they're still around today. And religious ecstatics are people who have frequent and vivid experiences of another level or layer or dimension of reality in addition to the visible world of our ordinary experience. Religious ecstatics are people who frequently enter non-ordinary states of consciousness. And the variety of religious experiences that fall into the category of experiences of religious ecstasy is great. Such experiences include visions. They include the shamanic experience of a vivid sense of not only seeing into another world, but actually journeying into another world. They include experiences of nature mysticism, which I understand is a kind of eyes-open mysticism where you see the same world you always see, only it is filled with the radiant presence of God, transfigured before you, and bushes burn without being consumed. Eyes closed kinds of mystical experiences, which are called introverted mystical experiences, which may be experiences of union with what is or communion with what is. There are both types. Abraham Maslow's peak experiences fall into this category, as I think do Martin Buber's I-Thou experiences. The enlightenment of the experience of the Buddha is an experience of religious ecstasy. Now, once one realizes that there really are experiences like this, and there really are figures in human history who have these experiences frequently and vividly, And that the Jewish tradition, both before the time of Jesus and contemporary with the time of Jesus, had many such figures like this. And that all of the central, is that too strong? Most of the central figures of that tradition are religious ecstatics. Moses, Elijah, the classical prophets, and I don't need to provide you with a complete list. When once you see that there really are people like that, then it seems to me to become transparently obvious that whatever else needs to be said about Jesus, he was one of these. Second stroke. He was a healer. Here I, like most scholars, make a distinction between healings and exorcisms on the one hand and nature miracles on the other hand. And we tend to see the nature miracles as symbolic narratives, the walking on the water, the multiplication of loaves, and so forth, and not as historical narratives. But I, along with most scholars, would say that some of the healings and exorcisms go back to Jesus. Indeed, it's interesting to me that more healing stories are told about Jesus than about any other figure in the Jewish tradition. He must have been a remarkable healer. I think I have time for a quick footnote to that. Some scholars make a distinction between healing illness and curing disease. Illness is defined as the social meaning of a physical condition, disease as the physical condition itself. Medical anthropologists, some of them make this distinction. Some scholars have therefore argued that Jesus may have healed illness, namely removed the social stigma attached to a physical condition, but not cured disease. I think that's highly unlikely. I don't think a peasant would be very impressed with the claim that your illness is healed if the physical condition remained. So I think Jesus both cured diseases and healed illnesses. Third stroke, a wisdom teacher. And by a wisdom teacher here, I mean a particular kind of wisdom teacher. There are teachers of conventional wisdom on the one hand, and there also are occasionally teachers of a subversive and alternative wisdom that radically call into question the conventions, the cultural consensus of the religious tradition or the culture in which they live. Lao Tzu and the Buddha were teachers of a subversive and alternative wisdom in their cultures and their time. I see Jesus also as a teacher of a subversive wisdom, a wisdom that radically undercut the taken-for-granted notions of his culture and religious tradition and invited his hearers into a radically new way of seeing. And I see this as sort of the primary purpose of most of his aphorisms, his short sayings, and his parables. And I'll say more about that in my second talk. Fourth stroke. He was a social prophet. Now, the adjective social here is important. I don't think of him as a prophet in the modern popular sense of the word as, as somebody who predicts the distant future. But rather, social prophet is like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. There is a future element to what they're talking about, but for the most part, it's a very near future that flows out of the present. But the primary quality of a social prophet in the Hebrew Bible is that in the name of God, a social prophet protests against the oppression and injustice of a domination society. And I see the social world of Jesus' day, of first century Jewish Palestine, as basically, to use Walter Wink's fine expression, a domination system. By that I mean it was a society composed of what I call the 3 Ps, a peasant society, a purity society, and a patriarchal society. And I can't develop those in detail right now. But a peasant society is basically a society in which roughly 10% of the population living in cities, the urban elites, receives about 2/3 of the income of the society, and of course the primary source of income is agricultural production. So 2/3 of the production of peasants is siphoned off by elites living in the cities. The top 1 to 2% of the population, the king and the governing class, receive about half of the total wealth of the economy. The point being that a peasant society is an economically exploitative society, and in Jesus' time its ideology was purity, and it was also a patriarchal society. And I see Jesus as a social prophet indicting the domination system of his time, both with prophetic threat oracles and with prophetic acts. I also see him speaking of an alternative social vision, one that is centered in compassion and not in purity, and about that I will also say more in my second talk. And fifth and finally, he was a movement, and here I don't quite yet have the right next word, so you can help me with that if you have any suggestions. I used to speak of him as a movement founder, and I'm okay with that. But I don't think there was ever a moment when Jesus said or thought, hereby found a movement. Okay? And so I now speak of him as a movement catalyst, or a movement catalyzer, which somebody quipped sounds like an air pollution control device. But what I have in mind with the expression catalyst or catalyzer is that a movement came into existence, I'm convinced, during the lifetime of Jesus. A movement came into existence around Jesus, and that was not foreign to his intention. That the movement that came into existence during his lifetime was for him an embodiment of that alternative social vision that he spoke of as a social prophet. I see his inclusive table fellowship, what Dom Crossan calls the open hospitality of Jesus, as an embodiment of the inclusiveness of the movement itself. And has really been of very central importance to Jesus as a historical figure and a historical actor. And thus, both as a social prophet and as a movement catalyst, Jesus not only protested against the sharp social boundaries of his day, but called into existence a community or a movement which negated those sharp social boundaries in its very existence and affirmed a much more inclusive way of being, an inclusive way of being that was felt to imitate and embody the compassion of God. Well, I have 16 seconds left. No, I have less than that. Okay, let me just do this. Return to the cross-cultural category for a moment. Like in Moses, I think of Jesus as somebody who knew God face to face and spoke with God mouth to mouth. Like a Socrates, I see Jesus as challenging the conventional wisdom of his day and teaching in his own way that the unexamined life is not worth living. Like a Buddha, I see him as having had an enlightenment experience and teaching the way of not grasping and compassion. Like a social prophet of the Hebrew Bible, and like a Gandhi of our own century, I see him as protesting against a society with sharp social boundaries and affirming a much more inclusive vision. And like a shaman, I see him as a healer. He must have been a most remarkable man.
Most frustrating rules of the game that we're operating today.
Okay, let's take a pause there and get your reaction. I mean, that's some pretty radical stuff. You know, it goes against the grain of what do you think?
Wow.
What do you think? I mean, he negates a lot, but he also says he takes. Remember that Marcus Borg, his teaching life has been presenting Jesus to a secular world without Christian presuppositions. But anyone, where do you see positive? Where do you see negative? Where does it stun you? Just some thoughts.
I totally agree with healer and the social prophet and stuff, but his not believing he's the Son of God is the big one.
Yeah, not believing. His self-understanding. Yeah. And there's a lot that negates that in a lot of the other studies. And we'll see that with N.T. Wright in a minute. Asa.
So I would say that message has been whispered mouth to ear from the beginning, before Jesus, through our time. And I'm certainly part of that chain. And there's certainly been others, and many of them have been burned in the city square for saying that.
And what is that message?
The message that Mr. Borg, Professor Borg, has been stating.
Okay.
I think Jesus thought he was the Son of God just as well as Julia and everybody in this room.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah, Jim?
It's interesting when he said that Jesus didn't see the crucifixion as a fundamental part of
Yeah.
his mission, because essentially that is the moment that the Christian faith blossomed, really.
Yeah, it's the core belief, and particularly, you know, the earliest proclaimer of the faith was Paul, and the cross was the center of Paul's understanding and theology. Okay? Yeah.
So it's an identity question. So how does he identify himself? It sounds like a lot of kind of perspective on Jesus that I hear Jews say.
Right.
So how is he defining himself?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and he's really going back to a more. There were in the early church there were really two schools of thought on Jesus, on the Christ, and that was one from Antioch, one from Alexandria, and he's much more of an Antiochene. How you like that word? School. I think he's. I don't know. I think we don't have in this particular lecture where he gleans that self-understanding of Jesus and why he didn't see his message as salvific, except to say that he really takes seriously the full humanity of Jesus. In other words, that Jesus faced the cross as any human being would be to face the cross, that he did not see it as part of his mission, but the church saw it afterwards in the light of the resurrection as a core fact that even though he was abandoned and he was afraid, and we do know he was afraid, I mean, that comes through Scripture. My God, why have you abandoned me? Quoting Psalm 22. That's in several Gospels. So we know that that whole aspect of the fullness of humanity was there. But the question is this self-understanding that he was there to face the cross as a sacrifice for sins, or is that something that the Jesus, pre-resurrection Jesus knew, or was it a post-resurrection reading back into Jesus' self-understanding? Does that make some sense? So we don't have a clear sense of that. George?
I've got a question. This might be sort of simplistic, but
No question is too simplistic.
with some talk, you just talked about the resurrection,
Yeah.
and some people believe rather than the crucifixion, the resurrection is where. But what would Marcus,
And we're going to get to that.
What would Marcus Borg say about the resurrection?
Oh, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Because we're now focusing, right now we're focusing on the pre-resurrection, but we're going to talk about the resurrection, and we'll delve into that, because that's the turning point from this historic Jesus to what we call the Christ. And the continuity between the Christ of faith, meaning the statement of faith by the church, by the early church, that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ, the Messiah. You know, the word Christ and Messiah, the same words. Messiah comes from Hebrew, Christ comes from Greek, but they're the same word, and they both mean the anointed one anointed by God's Spirit. So that's the transition point, and then we see progressively what the early church, leading up to even our own experiences today, how we correlate that. My mentor, R.H. Fuller, in his book Foundations of New Testament Christology, which was a seminal book for all of these scholars, traces that line of continuity from the historic Jesus to our experience of Jesus today as the Christ. That's a kind of a hard concept. Does everyone get that? Anyone not get that? Anyone want to? There's no shame in that, because it's only taken me about 40 years to really thoroughly understand that, and then it's really a mystery. There were couple other statements. Yeah.
What's really scary is the social prophet paragraph, because we are obviously right now living in a peasant society, puritanical and patriarchal.
Yes.
coming out of it, but
Yeah.
their politics are just really tied up in what do you believe?
Yes. Yeah, and I'm trying to get the professor of religion from Virginia Wesleyan here. He and I have, his schedule has been really busy, but because he comes from the Mennonite tradition, and this whole aspect of of Jesus as a political figure, the politics of Jesus, is really his expertise. And so I'm hoping we can get him here. I'm hoping to get him here next Sunday, if possible, and have him talk a little bit about that, because he's written about 5 or 6 books, all focusing on this whole aspect of the tradition of peace and nonviolence, and how the politics of Jesus speak to that as an alternative, and the alternative community that he sets up, alternative to the values and social order of Rome, which is a lot closer to ours. You know, in a frightening world, Rome said, you got to have a strong armed forces. You got to protect yourself. And it worked for Rome. So what do you do with this Jesus who was talking about vulnerability? Okay, I can be vulnerable as a person to you, but what does it mean as a society to be vulnerable? That's pretty scary, I think. And I don't know what to do. I'll admit, I don't know what to do with that. Other thoughts before we go to N.T. Wright? Okay, let's go to, David.
Well, just to put it in perspective, I did some reading. Marcus Borg frequently uses the word mainstream scholars.
Yeah.
The Jesus Seminar consisted of 70 people.
Right.
On most of the votes, there were 40 people there.
Right.
The Society of Biblical Literature has 7,000 people in it.
Right.
There were none from the continent or European
Right.
at all. And no one from Yale, Chicago, Emory.
Yeah, a lot of them from little schools.
None of these were from what you might call mainline seminaries.
Right.
So if you recognize that they denuded the New Testament and a good way of pointing that out is that they wrote their own Bible.
Yeah.
The 5 Gospels, and none of Mark is considered accurate.
Yeah, which most mainline scholarship would disagree with.
And only 3 sentences in the Gospel of John were considered accurate.
Yeah.
So once you do away with all that, I think when you do away with that, then
That's what you're left with.
logical.
Yeah, that's what you're left with.
Done away with whatever historical
Yeah.
writings that we had from the 1st century, then you build your own in the 21st century.
Yeah. So let's look at N.T. Wright now. We're going to move to a very different perspective that really it comes much more out of the Christian presuppositions and might be helpful to fill this out. But I spent a lot of time on Borg because because I think it's helpful for us to look at all of these perspectives. You know, in a sense, if you want the foundational statement for this class, it's the statement of Jesus to Peter, "Whom do they say I am?" But ultimately, the second question is what each of us must answer for ourselves. Who do you say I am? And that's the fundamental question that we're going to wind up with. And so I want you to keep that. You're going to hear who they say I am, but ask yourself, but who do you say I am?
Straight off, like
All right, this is N.T. Wright.
But to say what we plan to say, and this calls for an enormous exercise of self-restraint. I've had this place discussing, and in some places sharply disagreeing, and other places qualifiedly affirming what Marcus has said, but that's not my task in these 20 minutes. I have, instead of a 5-stroke sketch, a set of 7 lenses, and since 7 lenses take longer to describe than 5 strokes, I'm not going to give such a long prologue, except just to say thank you all for your welcome. It's wonderful to be back here. and to discover that Vancouver does exist other than in July, which was something for which I have no first-hand evidence before today. I am going to assume huge chunks of stuff about method and about using the Gospels and all sorts of things which, if this was a course of lectures, one would go into. And I'm going to jump straight in, and if there are questions arising from what I do by jumping straight in, well, we can handle that a little later. The first lens, and I'm thinking in terms of the kind of telescope where you have different sorts of lenses in order to bring the eventual image into focus. The first lens that I think we need through which to see Jesus accurately is that he was a prophet. He was thought of as a prophet and intended to be thought of as a prophet and was happy to be thought of as a prophet. He spoke about himself as a prophet. It is impossible that a prophet should perish outside Jerusalem. A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, etc., etc. And somebody who was happy to be thought of as a prophet must have, and this is a historical, everything I say I want to be intending as a historical statement, not as a projection of a faith statement. That's by way of prologue.
It's important to hear.
Anyone who was happy to be thought of as a prophet must in some way have believed that he was being equipped and called by the God whom he believed in to be a mouthpiece to his people. John the Baptist must have believed that. It only makes sense to think of what John the Baptist did if we really think that he wasn't just blundering around doing whatever came naturally without reflecting on it. He must have thought to himself at some stage, I really believe that the God whom I worship has called me to do this. And I think that that is true of Jesus as well. And I think that much of Jesus' activity must be understood in that light. The disciples on the road to Emmaus said, he was a prophet, mighty in word and deed. And that mighty in word, all the parables, and mighty in deed, the mighty acts, the paradoxes which he did, sometimes misleadingly called miracles. Now, these are the characteristics of the prophet. That's my first lens. Then, perhaps most importantly, the second lens. Shorthand, he was an eschatological prophet announcing the reign of God. Eschatological prophet announcing the reign of God. And to understand the significance of this, we have to see that it was a fundamental Jewish belief. I'm not saying every Jew held it, but it's pretty basic to a great many varieties of Judaism of which we have good evidence. To think that world history, indeed cosmic history, hinges upon Israel's history. Post-Enlightenment thought finds that very difficult to imagine world history hinging on one little nation. However, of course, post-Enlightenment thought has tended to assume that world history and sometimes even cosmic history hinges on the history of the Western world from the middle 18th century to the middle 20th century, which is just as bad. That's the doctrine of election for Jews. And I believe that Jesus, as an eschatological prophet announcing the reign or rule of God, believed and articulated that this story of Israel, around which world history hinged, was now reaching its climactic moment. And because he was announcing the reign of God, this is still part of my second lens, but doing it this way, he was doubly subversive, because anyone saying that God is becoming king means that all the other kings around are at least being relativized and perhaps being severely downgraded, but that the way he was doing this was also subversive of other dreams about how Israel's God was becoming king, specifically the dreams cherished by, I think, a majority among his fellow Jews at the time. So he was announcing a doubly subversive rule or reign of God, characterized particularly, and again both of these are important and I'll come back to them later on today, by the belief which goes very closely with the idea of the rule or reign of God in such a passage as Isaiah 52, that Israel was at last really returning from her exile. She'd come back geographically but had not really returned from exile properly, and that was now going to happen. And that part of that was that her God, Yahweh, was at last returning to Zion. So my second lens is Jesus as an eschatological prophet announcing the reign of God in a doubly subversive fashion, to do with the fact that at last Israel was really returning from exile, and at last her God was really returning to be with her. And this claim is clear But if this is happening now, it's happening in some way strangely to do with what Jesus is doing and is about to do. So that's my second lens. My third lens is that this eschatological prophet is a prophet of renewal who believes that he is entrusted with the task of restoring or reconstituting Israel in and around himself, and at the same time warning of the consequences for those who fail to do that. Jesus, like John the Baptist, seems to have drawn to himself a group of followers who, like John the Baptist's disciples, or like some at least of the Essenes, thought that they were the true Israel. He and his followers constituted then the real Israel, which was therefore in some shape or form a counter-temple movement, a movement which stood over against the normal way by which Jews construed their reality and gave their own gave them their own sense of who they were. Within that, we find Jesus inviting all sorts and conditions to join him in this movement. We find him challenging them to live as the true Israel. You are the light of the world. That is something which is Israel-specific. And also warning, just like other prophets had both in the 8th century and more recently, that if people didn't come his way, then there would be an almighty disaster involving the very literal and physical destruction of the present Jewish way of life focused upon the temple. So he was a prophet of renewal, reconstituting Israel in himself and around himself, and warning of the consequences of failing to join in with this movement, particularly with his call, and here I'm very close to a lot of what Mark has said in his writings and personally, his call to peace, to compassion, and to a different sort of holiness, a holiness which consisted in compassion rather than in exclusiveness. So that's my third lens, a prophet of renewal. My fourth lens is that within all of this, and here I'm very grateful to Mark's work because he has continually and graciously forced this item on my attention until I can resist it no longer. Not that I wanted to, but I never saw how to fit it in before. He was a teacher of subversive wisdom. He drew on the rich Jewish tradition of wisdom, not, I think, on cynic wisdom ideas. The rich Jewish tradition of wisdom, which was very easily combined with prophecy, with eschatology, and with renewal, my first three lenses. These are not to be played off against one another. Jesus constantly sets out as a good wisdom teacher the way of wisdom and the way of folly, the way of life, the way of death. It all goes back to Proverbs chapters 1 to 8, that is developed in so many ways in the Jewish tradition. And Jesus' call to join in with what he was doing, to come the way of peace as opposed to the way of destruction, is the call to the true subversive wisdom over against the conventional wisdom which Jesus basically labels as folly. Then I see, following smoothly from these four lenses without a break, without a big crunching of gears, Jesus was a messianic claimant like many other messianic claimants in the Judaism of his day. We know of about 15 movements from the mid-1st century BC to the mid-2nd century AD. Not all of them explicitly messianic, but all of them focused upon some leader or other, some of whom actually had crowns put on their heads, some of whom actually were given royal robes by their followers. Jesus believed, I think, that he was called to this strange and risky vocation of actually being the king through whom Israel's destiny would be realized. That is not a strange thing for a 1st century Jewish eschatological prophet to come to believe about himself, or for such a figure's followers to believe about him. And please note, footnote, Messiah does not mean second person of the Trinity in 1st century, or as far as I'm concerned anywhere else, however much Christians have used the word Christ, the Greek translation of Messiah, as a shorthand for a kind of fully blown Nicene or Chalcedonian theology. But what must a Messiah do? A Messiah must not only remake Israel around himself, a Messiah must fight Israel's battles and defeat Israel's enemy. But in keeping with Jesus' subversion of the ideologies, the conventional wisdom all around him, Jesus was convinced that the real enemy was not Rome as 99% of people on the block would have said, but was evil which was so concentrated as to be almost personified into the Satan figure. And so Jesus, like some other Jews of his day, believed that he had been called to be the spearhead of this new Israel. And the word for that, one of the words for that is Messiah. But how did Jesus believe that his messianic mission would be accomplished? I believe that in line, again, with many other Jews of around this period, Jesus believed that Israel's destiny would be realized through a time of intense tribulation and suffering. And he believed that this God-ordained and God-prophesied fulfillment of Israel's destiny would actually be something that he would have to take upon himself. And that he, not in order to fulfill some abstract atonement theology, that's what I hear Mark rejecting, and that's not what I'm asserting. Jesus believed, as in a sense the Maccabean martyrs have believed, and as many other Jews believed, that the kingdom of God would come through a time of great tribulation and suffering, which he believed he had to take upon himself solely. So that if world history hinges upon Israel's history, Jesus believed that Israel's history would be fulfilled through his own history, his own personal history, and that that personal history would meet a violent end, and that was part of his vocation. We'll talk a lot more about that this afternoon.
Before we close, any reactions to this? Quite a different perspective and a much larger picture of Jesus' understanding of himself and his mission, that he would take on that suffering to himself, that he was in fact anointed, and that what he was, this self-understanding that his mission was picking up the mission of Israel to be a light, to lighten all nations. Questions or comments, reactions to what you've heard so far?
What I'd like to know is, how do you interpret subversive wisdom? How can wisdom be subversive?
Yeah. What he means is it subverts the wisdom of the age. In other words, the wisdom of the Roman culture, which at that time was the dominant culture, that said certain things such as, and Grant's here to remind me that I've got to stop, but that subverted a culture that valued, for example, if you go back to what Marcus Borg said, the culture in which most of the resources go to one very, very small group, a culture of oppression. Remember, Rome was highly oppressive in order to keep peace. A culture of exclusivity rather than inclusivity that welcomes all. A culture that focuses not on purity, in other words, separating people out to the good versus the bad, but one of compassion and understanding and welcome and hospitality and neighborliness, rather than a culture in which we are suspicious of our neighbor. So that's what he means by subversion. He doesn't mean a military subversion. He means a subversion of our values, of the values of the age, by a new set of values. And the word subvert comes from two words. The first, sub, going under, or lower in priority, and vert, which comes from Latin, which means to turn. So basically what he's doing is he's taking his wisdom, takes the dominant wisdom and puts it lower down here and raises up what he would call the wisdom of God.